About 3 months after arriving here, a small plane landed on our airstrip, and two swarthy-looking Cuban guys started walking up the island, and I approached them and asked them what they were doing here. And one of those gentlemen was Jose Basulto, who, it turns out, was one of the gentlemen that was on the island in 1960, trained here, left here, went to Guatemala, and then to the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, was captured and then released by the Cuban government. And at that point, my ears perked up, and I said, Bay of Pigs, Cuban exiles, prisoner in Havana, and that started a process of asking what in the world happened here during 1960. Useppa Island history is about 10,000 years of habitation, and we've proved that through archaeological digs and taken the history back to when the shoreline was 50 miles west of where we're standing and where it is today. So Useppa's been around for a long time. And in the last 100, 120 years, it's been a resort put together by a couple of industrialists from the Northeast, Mr. Roach from Chicago and Baron Collier from New York. Useppa is located just off the coast from Fort Myers, about 4 miles west of Pine Island, Florida, 6 miles north of Captiva and Sanibel, and about 3 miles south of Boca Grande. So it's on the southwest coast of Florida. In 1959, a man by the name of Castro, as you know, took over Cuba and kicked out Mr. Batista. And that led to a lot of exiled Cubans ending up in Miami, in effect, the first wave of Cuban exiles. Then Mr. Castro decided that he was going to be a communist and not a good friend of the United States, and the administration at that time, which was the Eisenhower administration, decided they did not like that. So by early 1960, the Eisenhower administration gave the CIA kind of carte blanche approval to put together a clandestine operation to bring the Castro government down. The first form it took was going to be a group of guerrillas, being trained and then put into the jungles of Cuba and fight a guerrilla war. In the spring of 1960, that escalated, and it turned into a recruitment of troops and an aggressive attack on the Bay of Pigs beach that occurred in April 1961. The operation the CIA set up on Useppa occurred in about February 1960. They approached the Collier family, which owned the island at that time, and the island was dormant. It was not in service or being used in any way. The Collier family didn't live here, and the island was not receiving guests. So the Collier family leased the entire island to the CIA, I believe for about a 2-year period. Well, they selected Useppa because it was a far enough distance from Miami so that they didn't have to be in close proximity to the Cuban exile community in Miami, first of all. Secondly, Useppa is a totally contained, remote island, and it could be used for a very private, which of course the CIA wanted a very private operation, so it fit their needs at that time. By March of 1960, the CIA started recruiting the Cuban exiles in Miami and bringing them over to the island for training and vetting to become the cadre of an eventual attack in Cuba. The CIA would recruit these young Cuban exiles, and they were an educated group of young men in Miami. They would put them in darkened out vehicles late in the afternoon, just about dark, transport them across the state of Florida, bring them to Pine Island, put them on a boat, and bring them out to the island before daybreak. So when the Cuban exile arrived here, he had absolutely no idea where he was. And then they went through a period of vetting and training and so forth. And that was done so that if the man didn't qualify, they could reverse that trip and dump him off back on the street corner in Miami, and he'd have no idea where he had been. During that time, there were about 60, almost 70 recruits that ended up being the initial cadre of Brigade 2506. Went through that vetting and training process here on Useppa. There were about 70 students or recruits, and there were about 15 CIA staff on the island at that time. The training the recruits did here was not war training. It was not physical training. That was done later on in Guatemala. What went on here with this initial cadre was they actually evaluated and vetted these people psychologically, and then trained them in radio operations and other clandestine activities, because they were all earmarked not to attack a beach, but they were at that time, their mission would be to enter Cuba on a clandestine basis, set up guerrilla operations, receive weapons from the CIA, and start a grassroots movement to remove Castro. That got changed to a more aggressive mission of attacking the beach with ships and a few airplanes and things like that. During the period that the brigade members were here on the island and the CIA, they used all the existing buildings on the island. Some of the old cottages, each of which had 6 or 8 bedrooms in, were their living quarters. The Collier Inn, which was the Collier residence, were their main kitchens, and they took all their meals in the Collier Inn. A building we call the Pro Shop, the Golf Pro Shop, which is an old historic building, was their administrative center on the island. From the time Jose Basulto first landed in late 1976, and I met him, there's been a continual stream of brigade members visit the island. And they're all closing the loop. The Bay of Pigs actually started here on Useppa in their minds. They had a 25th reunion and a 50th reunion here. And the 50th reunion was 3 years ago. There's no way to describe the feelings of this group of people. There were probably 100 people here, brigade members, their wives and family, of course the ones that survived. These are truly a band of brothers that went through great hardships and have very, very strong feelings about patriotism, about Cuba, about Castro, and so forth, and of course carry the stigma of, the failed Bay of Pigs. There's always the word failed associated with the term Bay of Pigs, and that hurts these gentlemen very much.